Good day, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Well, let's see. You might remember a few weeks or months ago I went through the process of downsizing my Pinhole camera collection. Well, I've decided I need to build another Pinhole camera. I know, it's a madness. It's a sickness. Stay tuned. Well, the context for this project is that for decades, I've been shooting primarily paper negatives with my Pinhole cameras, and I've decided I'd kind of like to start shooting more sheet film, mainly because, we have some beautiful skies here in the desert Southwest, but with paper negatives, you end up having to overexpose the sky so it looks completely white and blown out in order to get much landscape detail because of the spectral sensitivity of photo paper negatives. It doesn't really expose the reds and browns very well. What I really want are Pinhole images where you have that dark, dramatic sky with white clouds, and you can only really achieve that with panchromatic film that you've put a red filter on. The kind of image I'm looking for is a ultra wide angle image, and I happen to have a 4x5 Pinhole camera. You guys might remember this from one of my previous videos. This camera, though, is not an ultra wide angle of view. So this is the focal length roughly from the pinhole being about here to the film plane being roughly here. It's not really ultra wide angle at all. So I'm looking to build a much shorter camera. And the other challenge here is that I don't want to really go to the hardware store. I have a whole bin of scrap pieces of wood, and I'm just going to try to make this camera from scrap wood. Now, one of the other design features I'm going to try doing on this one is I would like to be able to use a colored filter for film, red, orange, or yellow filter, probably more toward the orange or red. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a little filter holder that's inside the camera, sort of inside behind the pinhole. And the reason why is if you put the filter on the outside of the camera, all the stray daylight coming in will refract into the filter and cause flare and all that. Whereas if it's inside the camera, the only light that's going to go through the filter is the light coming through the pinhole itself. So you should have less problems with flare, and also it should keep the filter cleaner. Certainly it'll keep my fingerprints off of it and all that. Well, okay, I've made some measurements and some sketches here on how I'm going to do this particular design. It's basically going to be a sandwich. This is like looking from the film holder on the bottom. I'm going to use a frame of these 3/4 inch sticks. Then I'm going to use a little baffle plate made from the 3/16 plywood, and then the 1.5 inch sticks that will be the body of the camera, and then the front of it will be made out of 3/16. I'm going to have a little hinged door plate on the back that keeps the film holder pushed up against this baffle. So this is kind of the mock-up I've put together with the 3/4 inch sticks. The film holder sits here. There's going to be a baffle plate on top of this that the film holder rests up against that basically covers up this part of the frame, and then the 1.5 inch wide frame members will be on top of that to make the body of the camera, and then another sheet of the plywood goes on top of that to make the front or the top of the camera or the front of the camera, so like that. So I'm going to start here by cutting out the frame members for the body. Two of the pieces will be 5.5 inches, and the other two will be 6.25, and that'll make up the main body part. The film back part, which is this layer right here, is going to be 3-sided, and I'm going to cut them this way so that the joints in these frames don't overlap with the joints in the body, so you won't get light leaks going all the way through. Okay, so the baffle is going to be made from a U-shaped piece. It's actually going to be 3 pieces, and then there'll be this 4th piece. The gap between these two will be the little gap for the ridge in the film holder. That's the light trap, right? That's going to be that little gap between these and this. So I just got to decide how I want to cut these out. Well, this is kind of a mock-up. All the parts have been cut. They have not been sanded or anything. They're just stacked here. So this is looking at the back of the camera. There's going to be a plate that hinges down in here and holds the film holder, but the film holder basically fits right in here. The groove right here for the ridge on the film holder. And the film holder goes in like that. Okay, so this is the main body, the sides that I've clamped together. So to make sure it's square, I usually measure the diagonals in millimeters. It turns out 239 millimeters on each diagonal from corner to corner should be square, and it is. These cheap hardware store clamps, just be aware that the 2 faces of the clamps aren't parallel. They kind of toe in like that. And so you have to be careful when you're squeezing the clamp together that it might cause things to shift. So I usually have them just touching out on the edges here as far as I can. Let's see here. Well, this is the alternative way to glue down a piece of wood instead of using a clamp, is to use a heavy jar of hardware. So there is this piece here, glued down. Got some more to go. Okay, so I have these 3 parts of the baffle around the front of the film holder. I'm using these 1/8 inch brass square pieces as spacers to get my gap set in here. And these are now set, and I'm going to use my gravitational clamping. If you don't want to spend money on expensive, high-quality clamps, this is the alternative here. It clamps only in one direction. You don't have any sliding going on, especially when you want to make something with a precise fit. And incidentally, when I had first cut these out, I didn't take into account the fact that the gap for the film holder ridge only needs to come out about here, and the rest of this needs to be filled in. So actually, these little brass pieces that I'm using as spacers, I'm actually going to be using these to fill in the hole, so it'll be light tight. And of course I'll put some black paint in there to seal it up. So on top of this, once those dry, we will have these 3 pieces, and this defines the area where the film holder sits down into right here, and then there'll be a clamping lid that comes down on it. So I have the frame glued in place, and just to test it, hey, the ridge on the bottom of the film holder fits into the groove very nicely, and very little play on the film holder. Nice. So I'm attaching some screw eyes to the frame behind the pusher plate. I've attached a little knob to the pusher plate here, and that is held in place with a flat thumb screw, and basically I'm going to just put a little recess in this foam core board so that it'll sit flat on here. And also I'm going to cut the corners off of this foam core so it follows the contour of the pusher plate. But next, I'm going to paint the interior of the body. So you might be tempted to want to spray paint the inside of the camera, and that is a really easy, quick way to do it. But I like brushing on this paint because I can fill in the corners a little bit thicker to make kind of a fillet to ensure that I have a good light seal. Sometimes you have little gaps in the pieces of wood, you'll have a light leak, and so between the glue itself and a little heavier application of paint in the corners, it ensures the camera is going to be light tight. And I do kind of like the whole process of hand painting the inside. Okay, I'm scoring this plywood so that I can then cut it without the top layer delaminating on the edge. Using a razor knife, straight edge. This is going to be for the front of the camera. So if you score this about 10 times on each side, usually you can cut right through it. Okay, so this is the inside of the front panel of the camera. What I've done here is I've transferred the image plane from where the film holder sits onto the front, so I can therefore find the center of the front of the camera that coincides with the center of the film plane. So this will be where I'm going to put my pinhole. And this will give me also a good idea of how big I need to make the hole based on my angle of view and the thickness of this wood, so that I will have plenty of room around there for light not to get vignetted as it's going through. I'm going to mount the pinhole, I think, on the back of the inside. I'm going to have a holder for a colored filter, and then the shutter is going to be on the front side here. So one of the basic questions is, how big do I make the front hole in the front plate so that it won't vignette the image? And so, well, I have this focal length basically from mounting the pinhole on the inside of the front plate to where the actual film plane is on the film holder is going to be 48 millimeters at the center. And so then I measured the diagonal of my film format, and the diagonal is going to be 152 millimeters from corner to corner. So you have this kind of little ratio of 152 millimeters is the maximum light circle, and it's a 48 millimeter angle of view. And so you just do a simple ratio to figure out, well, the front plate on my camera is 5 millimeters thick. And so you calculate that out, it's about 16 millimeters, so I'm going to round up to about 20 millimeters. And so I'm going to need a drill bit to cut a roughly 20 millimeter hole, which is about this 3/4 inch Forstner bit should be able to cut my hole in the front of the panel of the camera, and it'll give me plenty of room for the light to go through without vignetting the corners. Well, so I'm in mid-process of making the front part of the camera. This is the inside front. So I have my 20 millimeter, well, 3/4 inch hole cut, and so I've masked off the area around the edge that's going to glue onto the rest of the camera body, so I didn't want to paint that first. And so I have some spacers made out of a combination of foam core and some cardboard, and this is for a colored filter that I can slip right in here, and I'll be able to filter the image behind the pinhole. Hopefully that means that the filter will get less light flare on it because it won't be exposed to the full sun. And then also I'm going to be mounting the pinhole itself right here, the piece of brass. So the piece of brass will be directly in front of the filter like that. And then I also have to put together the shutter. And the shutter is going to be made from this double thickness of thin wood. It's going to kind of be a pivot shutter like that. Well, okay, so here is the finished front of the camera. So we have our little shutter piece. It's made out of the double lamination of basswood, and it pivots like that. This is a brass machine screw. I didn't have a brass washer because we're doing whatever we find in our parts bin, and I didn't have one. I'm using a nylon locking nut on the back. I think that's an 832 for those of you sticklers for details. Anyway, so this is one of the usual ways I do it, is I have this little handle glued on. These are pieces of oak, and I have a little stop right here that stops it, so it's easy to open and close. Well, I started this camera build on Sunday afternoon, and it's now Wednesday morning. This isn't a jewelry box camera, and what I mean by that is my intention is purposefully for this not to be a finely crafted piece of woodworking that looks like a jewelry box. It's crafted, but it's a functional camera. So I did put one thin coat of some clear polyurethane on the other 5 sides of the camera besides the front. I didn't put it on the front because of the sliding shutter, but to cure that varnish overnight, I put it in my film drying cabinet. And here it is right here. So it took me 4 tries to get the pinhole to the right size. It is 1/4 of a millimeter, 0.25 millimeters. And when I started this 4th attempt at making the pinhole, I actually had the initial hole I made was 1/7 of a millimeter, which is, 0.15 or something like that. So that was probably the smallest pinhole I'd ever actually successfully made by hand with a sewing needle. And then it took me numerous trials to slowly get this wallered out to 1/4 of a millimeter. So the camera's focal length is roughly 50 millimeters from the center, but it's out about halfway out to the edge of the film. It's going to be about 75 millimeters. So I'm gonna figure the focal length of the camera, because it's such a wide angle, is about 75 millimeters, and that's what I'm going to use to calculate the focal ratio, which is going to be with 1/4 of a millimeter. That's f300, an f300 pinhole. There's a few finishing touches I haven't done to the camera yet. One of those is I want to put some viewing dots, a little triangle of 3 little brass brads on the top and on the left side as an aid in viewing. I probably won't get around to that today. That'll be for another day. But I do want to take the camera out and get a first initial set of exposures. Now, because I haven't been shooting sheet film for a long time, and with sheet film with pinhole camera exposures that go beyond a second or so, you typically have to compensate for reciprocity failure, which you don't have to do with paper negatives. So just because of my familiarity with paper negatives, I think I'm going to go ahead and shoot some paper initially in the camera. I'm not going to use the red internal filter because, of course, that won't really work with paper negatives. So I'll just do an unfiltered pinhole, some paper negatives, just to get an idea of the exposure, the angle of view, and how the camera works. Okay, so I'm going to use this Pinhole app on my phone, and it's saying about 17 seconds. So I should have a timer function here. All right. All right. Now, put the dark slide back in. And I'm going to go process this first negative before I waste any more paper. Hopefully it'll be good. It looks like good results. You know, I am using a brand new to me Pinhole app on my iPhone. I've never used it before. And I just got it. Just figured I'd try it. And boy, it looks like the exposure came out really pretty much dead on. Alright, so this is Arista Grade 2 RC paper, semi-matte finish. Freestyle Photo sells this. I rate it at an ISO of 12. Okay, so for this next shot, I'm just going to shoot this decorative southwestern style feature in my courtyard wall, and it's going to be a wide angle shot, so this whole wall is going to kind of recede away dramatically, hopefully. All right, put the film holder in. Pull the dark slide. Okay. All right, hopefully that was good. Well, this one came out pretty good, and I thought my composition was pretty close to what I wanted, considering I'm not really composing with viewing dots, just estimating. So my friend Ethan jokingly talks about the world-famous Joe Van Cleve backyard. Well, I do take a lot of pictures out here because I have my darkroom close by, and I can do these test shots, immediately go in and develop them and get immediate feedback on the process. I do want to go out, of course, and take some more iconic New Mexico photographs other than the Joe Van Cleve world-famous backyard. But here we are with an old wall and a tree. Let's see what we can do here. Got my film holder in there. Going to take an exposure reading of the wall, and it says it's going to be about 1 minute 23 seconds. All right. I don't know if you can see that, but it's timing down. Make sure I stay out of the picture. It's an awful wide angle. I mean to say wider than you might expect. Not that it's awful, but it's okay. Well, I'm pretty amazed by that light meter app. It nailed the exposure right here that I had the camera set to on the app. Looks like I got some shadow detail a little bit back here and nice and dark along this side of the wall. But yeah, it looks like it nailed the exposure pretty nicely on the main part of the image. Well, I'm going to try to do this kind of structure, the trellis, and then the trees in the background, hopefully. And let's see what happens. Looks like 1 minute 12 seconds. Well, this is pretty good, I thought. Okay, I got to rinse these prints, get them dried. Rinsing the pictures under the tree. Also rinsing my tongs. They probably need to be rinsed good too. Well, we used to go through and look at these negatives real quickly, so I was really happy about this particular negative, and the exposures are really good. You can still see a little bit of detail separating the bright petals of the metal flower. There's two different tones to it, and yeah, the middle grays on the trellis, and even the fainter shadow detail in the background. Pretty nice exposure overall, considering the angle of view of the camera in the harsh morning daylight. And then this shot of my window in the wall of the courtyard, I like the dramatic lines, the receding lines from the wide angle. And yeah, this nice southwestern style little window with the wooden elements and all that. It's just kind of an interesting shot, the texture and everything, so there's that. And then direct from Joe's world-famous backyard, I kind of like this shot. I like the sun, the shadows of the trees coming at an angle down across the wall, and the wall is kind of side lit, so you see a lot of the texture in it. And yeah, it's a kind of an interesting shot. I got the horizon pretty close to being straight there on the top of the wall, and then that sort of man-made versus nature kind of dichotomy between the two halves of the picture is kind of cool. I like the angle of it, looking up at this T structure on the trellis. The very top of the beam there is very close to being totally blown out. I'm almost positive it's going to be just totally white in the positive image. But anyways, I really like this. It kind of illustrates the drama of the ultra-wide angle of view. You can see the power line wires running through the neighbor's trees up there in the corner and the sky behind it. So really cool image. happy with all these. Well, this was a fun project. It took me roughly 3 days to build this off and on. I was hoping it would have taken me sooner, but these things always take longer than expected. It's just simple hand tools and simple power tools and simple joinery and construction methods that's totally pragmatic. The whole purpose for it is just to be able to make a functional camera that you can go and create images with. And in my case, the purpose of this one is, of course, I don't need another Pinhole camera, as you probably know, but the purpose of this one was to enable me to use 4x5 sheet film holders and a very wide angle of view. The real purpose for building this, though, was I really want to start shooting black and white sheet film out in the field. I want to get some scenic landscapes with the dramatic skies and the dark tones of the blue sky with the light clouds and ultra wide angle. I'm also kind of proud of the little design I come up with for the film holder. Instead of using rubber bands, bungee cords, or whatever for securing the film holder, I come up with this little design with little screw eyes, springs, and some brass rods and pieces made up like that. It does give pretty good tension onto the film back, especially the film back, the modern one that has the little locking button. That has to be pressed down right against the lip of the groove in order for the dark side to release, and it does work quite reliably, so I'm happy about that. The tripod bushing, I normally recess the T-nut from the other side, from inside, so all you have is the thread part showing. But my lack of planning, I hurriedly built this frame and glued it up together before I realized that I didn't put the tripod nut on, or the T-nut. And so I ended up putting it on this way, and it works fine. It works fine. I was happy with this camera. It was a fun project, and it's going to be, I think, a really functional tool for doing some landscape photography with film, and look forward to some more of that in the future, hopefully. And maybe I can go out into the environs of New Mexico other than Joe's world-famous backyard and actually get some real scenic stuff for you guys to see. Well, that's it. Any questions, comments, concerns, drop them down below. I'd love to have a dialogue with you. And until next time, stay safe and stay creative, and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.